The headline sounds cinematic, but the strategic stakes are not cinematic at all. If Iran has activated even a limited Russian S-500 architecture, then the balance above the Middle East changes from a contest of routine air superiority into a compressed race between detection and destruction, between deterrence and preemption, between one regional campaign and a much wider confrontation. That is the first layer of the story. The second layer is more important. The public discussion is still trapped at the surface, arguing over whether one dramatic transfer happened, while the more dangerous possibility is that a deeper integration may already be underway beneath the headline. Here is what you need to understand. States rarely announce the most important shift at the moment it becomes operational. They conceal it, test it, deny it, and then let adversaries discover it at the worst possible time. The third layer is the framework itself. This analysis will move through 4 questions. First, what is actually known about Russian systems, Russian personnel, and Iran's air defense recovery? Second, what would an S-500 class capability mean in technical terms? Third, why would Israeli planners treat even partial activation as a narrowing window rather than a static problem? And fourth, why would Washington read this not as one more weapons story, but as a sign that the old imperial geometry of the region is beginning to warp? The first point is methodological discipline. There is a difference between what is confirmed, what is plausible, and what is psychologically useful in wartime signaling. Reuters reported in February 2025 that Iran used its indigenous Bavar 373 together with Russian-made S-300 systems during a military exercise, specifically after Israeli strikes the previous October had been presented by Israel as having seriously degraded Iranian defenses. That matters because it shows 2 things at once. It shows that Iran wanted the world to see survivability after damage, and it shows that long-range air defense had become a prestige theater, not merely a military asset. Reuters also reported in March 2025 that 7 senior Russian missile specialists traveled to Iran on 2 flights, one on April 24th and another on September 17th, with backgrounds in air defense, artillery, rocketry, advanced weapons development, and missile testing. Reuters did not confirm a transfer of S-500 batteries. That absence is analytically important. Let me explain. When no public proof exists of a full transfer, the real question becomes whether Iran has received something more subtle than a complete ceremonial delivery: software logic, radar integration support, training for future induction, dispersed components, or doctrinal assistance for building a layered anti-access network that behaves like a more advanced system before it publicly looks like one. That distinction matters because the S-500, as described by the CSIS Missile Threat Project, is not simply a bigger S-300. It is a mobile surface-to-air and anti-ballistic missile system intended to counter aircraft, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and reportedly even low-orbit satellites. CSIS lists the broad range at roughly 500 to 600 kilometers. It notes that the 40N-6M interceptor is associated with targets such as aircraft and cruise missiles at around 400 kilometers, while the newer 77N-6 series is associated with ballistic missile or satellite interception out to 500 to 600 kilometers. More revealing is the radar architecture. The system is described as using 4 radar vehicles per battery, including the 91N6EM S-band acquisition radar, the 96L6 TSP C-band acquisition radar, the 76T6 multi-mode engagement radar, and the 77T6 anti-ballistic missile engagement radar. CSIS further notes claims that this radar complex could detect airborne targets out to approximately 800 kilometers and ballistic targets as far as 2,000 kilometers. Whether every one of those numbers performs exactly as advertised in combat is almost secondary. The strategic point is that such a system is designed not merely to shoot, it is designed to see first, classify faster, and force the attacker to operate inside a thicker fog of uncertainty. Now place those technical features into Iran's operational reality. Iran does not need a fully mature nationwide S-500 shield tomorrow in order to alter Israeli calculations today. It may need only a localized, partially networked, politically deniable enhancement around a few exceptionally sensitive nodes: nuclear infrastructure, command facilities, missile production complexes, or leadership bunkers. A single defended corridor can change the geometry of an air campaign because offensive planning depends on predictable paths, clean timing, and confidence in suppression. If new radars lengthen warning time, if engagement envelopes become less transparent, if decoys are mixed with real launchers, and if Russian advisors help harmonize Iranian, Russian, and indigenous systems into one kill chain, then Israel is no longer looking at a static target deck. It is looking at a trap that tightens with every hour spent waiting. The underdog lesson here is ancient. Smaller or weaker powers do not defeat superior air forces by matching them platform for platform. They survive by turning time into armor, dispersion into deception, and uncertainty into deterrence. In that sense, even the rumor of S-500 activation performs military work. It slows decision cycles. It forces intelligence collection to surge. It makes every unstruck site feel more dangerous than the last. That is why the phrase 48 hours, whether literal or rhetorical, captures the psychology better than the calendar. Israeli planners would not interpret a possible Russian-linked air defense activation as a challenge to be studied leisurely. They would interpret it as a closing interval before training completes, before crews rehearse under stress, before sensor fusion improves, before foreign technical personnel disperse, and before diplomatic costs rise. Here is what needs to be understood about modern air campaigns. The offensive side prefers to hit during transition, not after consolidation. Once a defensive network becomes familiar with local clutter, electromagnetic patterns, false targets, maintenance rhythms, and battle drills, the price of dismantling it rises sharply. That is especially true for an air force like Israel's, which has historically depended on compressing distance, surprise, electronic warfare, and intelligence into a very short sequence. If that sequence stretches, the attacker begins to reveal his own dependencies: tanker support, routing, standoff munitions inventories, suppression packages, rescue contingencies, alliance signaling, and political patience. This is where the headline about Israeli jets becomes less about aircraft and more about systems competition. Israel possesses some of the most capable strike aviation in the region, including stealthy F-35I aircraft and long-range F-15I platforms. But stealth is not invisibility, and range is not sovereignty. Every strike package operates inside a chain of assumptions: that detection will occur late enough, that jamming will be effective enough, that radars can be blinded or saturated, that the target set will not migrate, and that the defender cannot impose unacceptable attrition or political escalation. The introduction of even a partial S-500 logic into Iranian defenses threatens those assumptions at the level commanders fear most, the level before the first missile launch, where uncertainty expands and confidence collapses. The trap metaphor becomes useful here because the trap is not simply an interceptor waiting for a jet. The trap is strategic overconfidence. A power accustomed to entering contested airspace and dictating tempo may discover that it is now being lured into a more layered exchange, one in which every additional sortie requires more support aircraft, more coordination, more suppression, and more exposure. Empires often decline not because they lose one battle spectacularly, but because each new operation demands slightly more effort for slightly less certainty. And that is precisely why the Pentagon would view such a development with alarm, even without public melodrama. Panic is too theatrical a word for bureaucracies, but compression of options is not theatrical at all. Washington's concern would begin with the obvious military question: if Israeli operations become riskier, does the United States provide more intelligence, more refueling, more missile defense cover, more naval positioning, more diplomatic shielding, or more direct contingency planning? Then comes the wider problem. If Russian personnel, Russian doctrine, or Russian hardware are physically enmeshed with Iranian defense sites, any Israeli or American strike carries a higher probability of a second-order confrontation. That does not mean war with Russia is inevitable. It means escalation ladders become crowded. A radar vehicle is no longer just a radar vehicle. It becomes a political tripwire, an intelligence node, a prestige symbol, and a bargaining chip in every negotiation from Ukraine to the Gulf. This is how regional military stories mutate into systemic ones. The issue ceases to be whether one battery was delivered. The issue becomes whether the regional order is now hosting overlapping great power commitments inside the same kill zones. History offers a pattern that is older than the states involved. Large powers repeatedly mistake access for control. They assume that because they can reach a theater, they can shape the theater indefinitely. Rome believed Eastern campaigns could be managed through superior organization until the frontier kept teaching a harsher lesson. Geography, time, and resilient opponents imposed their own arithmetic. Later empires repeated the same error with better machines. They could strike farther, see more, and mobilize faster, yet still found themselves trapped by the cost of sustaining dominance at the edge. Let me explain the Persian dimension of this pattern. Iran's strategic culture, whether one admires it or opposes it, is deeply conditioned by survival under pressure. Sanctions, isolation, sabotage, covert action, proxy attrition, cyber operations, and repeated threats have not produced passivity. They have produced adaptation. That does not make Iran invincible, it makes Iran patient. And patient states are dangerous precisely because they accept asymmetry as normal. They do not need symmetrical victories. They need only to make the stronger adversary pay more each cycle than the adversary expected to pay. This is the underdog resilience arc that so many outside observers miss. In Western strategic storytelling, technological superiority is often treated as the climax. In reality, technological superiority is only the opening bid. The real contest begins when the weaker side organizes its pain tolerance, its camouflage, its redundancy, and its political narrative around survival. Iran has spent years building missile depth, dispersal habits, underground facilities, and layered defense concepts because it understands the most important law of contested regions. The first strike rarely decides the war. The side that still functions after the first strike begins to write the next chapter. That is why reports of Russian specialist travel matter more than sensational thumbnails. 7 experts on 2 flights may sound modest. In military adaptation, modest inputs can create non-linear outputs. One advisor can shorten learning curves. One integration team can connect systems that used to operate in parallel. One improvement in target classification can reshape the confidence of an entire command structure. And now the imperial decline meta-narrative comes into focus. The United States still possesses overwhelming global power. Israel still possesses superior regional strike capability. But superiority is not the same as freedom from friction. In a declining imperial phase, the dominant power does not suddenly become weak. It becomes overextended, increasingly dependent on rapid coercion, and progressively irritated by any actor capable of lengthening the timeline. That is the real meaning of advanced air defense in this story. It is not merely a shield. It is an instrument for stretching time against a system that depends on speed. It is a way for a sanctioned state to force technologically superior adversaries into longer deliberations, costlier mission planning, and more visible political choices. Every additional day of hesitation becomes strategic space for Tehran, diplomatic space for Moscow, and psychological space for every other actor watching whether American-backed military pressure still produces the old automatic obedience. So what happens next? 3 scenarios deserve serious attention. The first, and in many ways the most probable, is not a full S-500 deployment but a partial integration effect. In this scenario, Iran has not received a complete, transparent Prometheus regiment. Instead, it has received technical assistance, selective components, or doctrinal support that improve the performance of existing Bavar 373 and S-300 layers around critical sites. Probability, roughly 50%. In this case, Israeli planners may indeed feel they have a shrinking window, not because the system is unbeatable, but because the system is becoming less legible by the week. The operational response would likely emphasize accelerated intelligence collection, cyber probing, deception testing, and perhaps limited strikes designed to expose the network before a larger decision is made. The second scenario is information warfare wrapped around a real but smaller military change. Probability, roughly 30%. Here, the rumor of S-500 activation is itself a weapon. Tehran benefits if adversaries overestimate the maturity of its defenses. Moscow benefits if rivals begin to price Russian influence back into every Middle Eastern calculation. Even if the underlying improvement is only incremental, the perception of a leap can still deter, delay, and divide. This would be classic strategic theater, but theater should never be confused with irrelevance. In geopolitics, perception modifies behavior, behavior alters deployments, and deployments create new facts on the ground. If Israeli sorties are delayed, if U.S. naval assets reposition, if energy markets begin pricing escalation risk, then the information operation has already produced tangible returns. The third scenario is the least likely but most consequential. a genuine limited S-500 shadow deployment or near deployment around an ultra-sensitive Iranian node. Probability, perhaps 20%. Not a nationwide umbrella, not a triumphant parade, a shadow deployment. A concealed, narrow, high-value protective ring intended less for routine air defense than for crisis deterrence. If that is the case, then the famous 48 hours would refer not to a magical deadline, but to the period before the defending side completes concealment, mobility cycles, crew hardening, and doctrinal rehearsal. Under that scenario, the Pentagon's concern would intensify because any strike package probing such a site could trigger a chain of exposure involving Russian technology, Russian advisory roles, and a much more overt contest over who controls escalation in the region. The prediction, therefore, is not that Israeli aviation suddenly becomes obsolete. That would be unserious. The prediction is narrower and more important. If credible indicators continue to accumulate of Russian-assisted air defense integration in Iran, Israeli and American planning will shift from confidence in episodic punishment toward anxiety about sustained suppression. That is a profound change. Episodic punishment is cheap in political terms. Sustained suppression is expensive, visible, and uncertain. It consumes munitions, attention, diplomatic capital, and strategic patience. It also creates opportunities for miscalculation. A radar that was supposed to warn may fire. A probing strike may hit foreign personnel. A defensive move may be interpreted as offensive preparation. Once those thresholds begin to blur, the region moves from deterrence theater into pre-delegated escalation. The broader prediction is even more uncomfortable. The Middle East is entering a phase in which defense networks, drones, missiles, satellites, cyber tools, and great power partnerships are compressing the old hierarchy. Not erasing it, compressing it. Strong states remain stronger. But weaker states are learning how to make superiority arrive later, cost more, and persuade less. That is the reluctant truth running beneath the sensational title. The story is not really about one secret system. The story is about whether the age of easy punitive entry is ending. If it is, then every capital built on the assumption of automatic aerial dominance will have to rethink both its doctrine and its mythology. One more point deserves emphasis. Air defense modernization is rarely linear. Crews learn, fail, relocate, and rehearse under pressure. Operators discover which radar emissions invite targeting, which launch signatures betray concealment, which command links survive jamming, and which decoy patterns actually confuse analysts. In the first days of any activation, those lessons are still being written. After several weeks, they harden into routine. That difference is why adversaries fear the moment of maturation more than the moment of announcement. Once doctrine, hardware, and local geography begin cooperating, the defender no longer relies on slogans. He relies on repetition. And repetition is the foundation of deterrence, because a network that has practiced together can absorb surprise without collapsing into improvisation in combat conditions. And that brings the analysis to its final synthesis. The available evidence does not publicly prove that Iran has fully activated Russian S-500 batteries. What it does show is already significant. Iran has publicly demonstrated Russian-made S-300 systems alongside Bavar 373 after earlier Israeli strikes. Reuters documented travel by 7 Russian missile specialists to Iran, and the known design logic of the S-500 points toward a capability centered on long-range detection, layered interception, and strategic ambiguity. Taken together, those facts justify serious concern without requiring theatrical certainty. Here is what should remain in view. The strongest powers are often least comfortable when the battlefield stops rewarding speed and starts rewarding patience. Iran's objective is not to become stronger than its adversaries in the abstract. Its objective is to make them slower, more cautious, more expensive, and more politically exposed. If that process is underway, then the shift has already begun. Whether or not the world sees an S-500 launcher on television tomorrow, there is, of course, uncertainty. Any honest analysis must say so plainly. Weapons claims are manipulated, states bluff, intelligence services leak selectively. Radar performance on paper is not radar performance under fire. A hidden deployment can be real, exaggerated, or entirely instrumental, but uncertainty does not eliminate the pattern. It reveals the pattern. In moments like this, the most revealing question is not whether every rumor is literally true. The revealing question is why so many actors behave as if the rumor could be true, and what that behavior changes before the truth is fully known. That is where the future begins. If more evidence surfaces of Russian-Iranian integration at the air defense level, then the next phase will not simply concern missiles or jets. It will concern the erosion of an older strategic habit, the habit of assuming that regional skies belong by default to whoever arrived with the most advanced aircraft. That assumption is now under review, and history tends to move quickly once assumptions enter review.